In the oppressive heat of a Georgia summer in 1856, on a cotton plantation 40 miles south of Savannah, there lived a woman whose very existence challenged everything that the white slave-holding class believed about the natural order of their world. Her name was Sarah, though the enslaved people who knew her called her Goliath's daughter for her extraordinary height and strength. Standing 6 feet 8 inches tall, with shoulders as broad as most men's and hands that could span a man's head, Sarah was a physical anomaly in an era when the average woman stood barely over 5 feet. But it was not her size that would make her legendary throughout the South and eventually throughout the nation. It was what she did with that size on the night of August 12, 1856, when she crushed her master's skull with her bare hands and set in motion a series of events that would expose the brutal reality of slavery and force both North and South to confront questions about violence, justice, and the humanity of enslaved people. To understand Sarah's story and the explosive violence that made her infamous, we must first understand who she was before that terrible night, because Sarah was not born a killer. She was born enslaved on a Virginia plantation in 1828, the daughter of a woman named Ruth who was herself unusually tall, standing nearly 6 feet. Sarah's father was unknown, or at least unacknowledged, as was common for children born to enslaved women. From her earliest childhood, Sarah was different from other children. By age 5, she was as tall as children twice her age. By 10, she stood taller than most adult women. By 15, she had reached her full height of 6 feet 8 inches, a stature that made her a curiosity and a valuable commodity in the twisted economics of slavery. Sarah's extraordinary size meant that she was put to work in the fields rather than in domestic service, where her appearance might have been considered unseemly or disturbing to refined white sensibilities. She could do the work of 2 ordinary field hands, could lift and carry loads that required multiple people, could work from sunup to sundown without the physical exhaustion that broke smaller people. To the men who owned her, Sarah was valuable property, a workhorse whose strength could be exploited for maximum profit. But to Sarah herself, her size was both a blessing and a curse. It gave her physical power that few enslaved people possessed, but it also made her more visible, more noticeable, and therefore more vulnerable to the cruelty of enslavers who saw her as something less than human. When Sarah was 20 years old in 1848, she was sold away from the Virginia plantation where she had been born. Her mother Ruth had died the previous year, and the plantation owner who had owned them both was settling debts by selling off some of his enslaved people. Sarah was sold at auction in Richmond to a slave trader who specialized in acquiring enslaved people with particular characteristics that would fetch premium prices in the deep South cotton regions. Tall, strong men and women were in high demand on cotton plantations where the brutal work of clearing land, planting, tending, and harvesting cotton required physical strength and endurance. Sarah was transported in chains along with dozens of other enslaved people on the long, terrible journey from Virginia to Georgia, a journey that took weeks and involved forced marches, crowded holding pens, and constant degradation. Many of the people who began that journey did not survive it, succumbing to disease, exhaustion, or despair. But Sarah survived, her physical strength sustaining her through conditions that killed weaker people. She arrived in Savannah in the fall of 1848, was sold again at auction, and ended up on a cotton plantation owned by a man named William Calhoun. The Calhoun plantation, called Riverside for its location along a tributary of the Savannah River, was a substantial operation covering nearly 2,000 acres and worked by approximately 100 enslaved people. William Calhoun was 43 years old when Sarah arrived at his plantation in 1848, a second-generation slaveholder who had inherited Riverside from his father and had expanded its operations and profitability. Calhoun was known in the region as a harsh master, even by the brutal standards of slavery. He believed in working enslaved people to the absolute limits of their endurance, in using violence and terror to maintain control, and in maximizing profit regardless of the human cost. Calhoun's overseer, a man named Jacob Marsh, was responsible for the day-to-day management of the enslaved workforce and for administering the punishments that Calhoun believed were necessary to maintain discipline. Marsh was known for his cruelty and for his particular enjoyment of inflicting pain. He carried a bullwhip that he used frequently and without hesitation, and he took pride in his ability to break the spirit of even the most resistant enslaved people. The combination of Calhoun's ruthless drive for profit and Marsh's sadistic enforcement created an environment of constant fear and suffering at Riverside Plantation. Sarah was put to work in the fields immediately upon her arrival. Her height and strength were recognized and exploited. She was given tasks that would have required multiple people, clearing land, moving massive logs, carrying loads of cotton that would have broken the backs of smaller workers. Sarah worked without complaint, at least outwardly. She had learned early in life that resistance led to punishment, that challenging white authority meant beatings or worse. She kept her head down, did her work, and tried to survive in a world designed to destroy her humanity and use up her body. But Sarah was not entirely without community and connection at Riverside. She formed relationships with other enslaved people, particularly with an older woman named Grace who had been at Riverside for decades and who took younger people under her protection when she could. Grace taught Sarah the unspoken rules of survival on the plantation, the ways to avoid attracting unwanted attention, the strategies for preserving some small measure of dignity and autonomy within the oppressive system. Grace also told Sarah stories about resistance, about enslaved people who had fought back or escaped, about the Underground Railroad that helped people reach freedom in the North. These stories planted seeds in Sarah's mind, ideas about resistance and freedom that would grow over the years. Sarah also formed a relationship with a man named Samuel, another enslaved worker on the plantation. Samuel was in his mid-20s, strong and capable, one of the few men at Riverside who stood nearly as tall as Sarah. They were drawn to each other, finding comfort and companionship in a world that tried to deny them both. In 1850, Sarah and Samuel had a ceremony of commitment, what enslaved people called jumping the broom, since they were not allowed legal marriages. They built as much of a life together as was possible under slavery, supporting each other through the daily grinding brutality of plantation life. In 1851, Sarah gave birth to a daughter, whom she named Ruth after her own mother. The birth of this child changed something fundamental in Sarah. She had something to protect now, someone who depended on her, a reason to endure that went beyond mere survival. Sarah loved her daughter with a fierce intensity, saw in her a future that might somehow be better than the present, dreamed of impossible things like freedom and safety for this child. For 3 years, Sarah raised Ruth as best she could within the constraints of slavery, teaching her, protecting her, loving her. But in 1854, when Ruth was 3 years old, William Calhoun sold her. A slave trader visiting the plantation had offered a good price for young children who could be raised and trained for domestic service, and Calhoun saw an opportunity for profit. Sarah begged him not to sell her daughter, actually got down on her knees and pleaded, promising anything if he would just let her keep her child. Calhoun was unmoved. He told Sarah that Ruth was his property to dispose of as he saw fit, that Sarah had no rights over her own child, that if Sarah caused trouble about this, she would be whipped. Ruth was taken away screaming for her mother, and Sarah never saw her again. The loss of her daughter broke something in Sarah. The grief was crushing, all-consuming, a pain that never lessened or healed. But alongside the grief grew something else: rage. A cold, focused rage at the man who had taken her child, at the system that allowed such cruelty, at her own powerlessness to protect the person she loved most. Sarah continued to work, continued to go through the motions of daily life, but inside she was changing. The woman who had learned to survive by keeping her head down and not challenging authority was being replaced by a woman who had been pushed beyond endurance, who had lost everything that mattered, and who was beginning to think about violence as a form of justice. Samuel tried to comfort Sarah, to help her through her grief, but he was struggling with his own pain at the loss of Ruth and his own rage at their powerlessness. The relationship between Sarah and Samuel became strained, both of them changed by the trauma of losing their child. In 1855, Samuel was sold away from Riverside, separated from Sarah just as Ruth had been. Sarah was now truly alone, having lost her mother years before, then her daughter, then her partner. She had nothing left but her work, her rage, and her physical strength. The 2 years following Samuel's sale saw Sarah retreat into herself. She became more isolated, speaking little even to the other enslaved people who tried to reach out to her. She worked with mechanical efficiency, her body going through the motions while her mind was elsewhere, perhaps with Ruth, perhaps planning something that she kept to herself. The overseer Jacob Marsh noticed the change in Sarah and interpreted it as sullenness and defiance. He began to single her out for particularly harsh treatment, assigning her the most difficult tasks, watching for any excuse to punish her, trying to break what he perceived as her spirit of resistance. But Marsh miscalculated. Sarah was not being broken. She was being forged into something harder and more dangerous. Every punishment, every degradation, every act of cruelty added to the rage that was building inside her. And Sarah's size meant that she was physically capable of things that most enslaved people could only dream of. She had the strength to kill a man with her bare hands if she chose to use it. All that was missing was the moment when she would choose to do so. That moment came in August of 1856. The details of what triggered the final confrontation between Sarah and William Calhoun have been reconstructed from testimony given by enslaved witnesses and from the physical evidence found at the scene. What is known is that, on the evening of August 12, 1856, William Calhoun came to the area where the field workers were housed after their day's labor. He had been drinking, which was common for him in the evenings, and he was in a foul mood about something, though what specifically had angered him is unclear. Calhoun began berating the workers, finding fault with their day's labor, threatening punishments for perceived laziness or incompetence. When he got to Sarah, he focused his anger on her specifically, calling her names, telling her she was worthless despite her size, saying that she needed to be taught a lesson about proper respect and obedience. Sarah said nothing in response, which only increased Calhoun's anger. He ordered her to come with him, saying he was going to have Jacob Marsh whip her to teach her proper deference. What happened next occurred very quickly according to the witnesses. As Calhoun reached out to grab Sarah's arm to force her to come with him, Sarah moved. With shocking speed for someone her size, she grabbed Calhoun by the throat with one massive hand and lifted him off his feet. Calhoun's eyes went wide with shock and terror as he realized what was happening. He clawed at Sarah's hand, tried to break her grip, but he might as well have been trying to bend iron bars. Sarah's hand was too strong, her grip too powerful. Sarah looked directly into Calhoun's eyes as she held him suspended by his throat, watching him struggle and choke, and then she spoke the only words she would say during the entire incident. "You took my baby." Then, with her other hand, Sarah struck Calhoun on the side of his head with such tremendous force that witnesses reported hearing the crack of his skull breaking. She struck him again, and again, her massive fists crushing his skull like an eggshell, continuing to beat him even after he had gone limp and was clearly dead. When Sarah finally stopped and dropped Calhoun's body to the ground, There was complete silence among the assembled enslaved people who had witnessed what had happened. They were stunned, terrified of what this would mean for all of them, but also, some of them would later admit, awed by what Sarah had done. She had killed William Calhoun, their master, the man who had held power of life and death over all of them, and she had done it with her bare hands. For a moment the impossible had happened. An enslaved person had struck back. Sarah made no attempt to flee. She stood over Calhoun's body, her hands covered in his blood, and waited. Some of the other enslaved people tried to convince her to run, to try to reach the swamps where she might hide, but Sarah refused. She said she had done what needed to be done, and that she would face whatever came next. Within an hour, white men had arrived at the plantation, having been summoned by one of the house slaves who had witnessed the killing. They found Sarah still standing where she had killed Calhoun, making no resistance as they bound her with chains and took her away. The news of what had happened at Riverside Plantation spread rapidly throughout the region. An enslaved woman had killed her master, had beaten him to death with her bare hands. The reaction was a mixture of shock, outrage, and fear among the white population. If one enslaved person could kill their master so brutally, what did that mean for the safety of all slaveholders? Were they all in danger? The incident touched on the deep fear that slaveholders lived with constantly, the fear that the people they held in bondage would one day rise up and take terrible revenge for years of cruelty and oppression. But there was another element to the reaction that made Sarah's case particularly sensational: her size. The idea of a nearly 7-foot-tall woman with the strength to crush a man's skull was terrifying and fascinating in equal measure. Sarah became a symbol, a monstrous figure in the minds of white Southerners, evidence of the dangerous nature of enslaved people if they were not kept under strict control. But she also became something else to enslaved people throughout the region and eventually throughout the South. She became a hero, a symbol of resistance and power, proof that even the most powerful slaveholder was vulnerable. Sarah was held in the county jail while authorities determined what to do with her. Under the laws of Georgia and the South generally, enslaved people could be tried for crimes including murder, though the legal proceedings were quite different from trials of white people. Sarah would not have a jury of her peers, would not have the presumption of innocence, and would have limited ability to present a defense. The outcome of her trial was essentially predetermined. She had killed her master in front of witnesses, and there could be only one punishment for such an act. But before the trial could proceed, something unusual happened that would make Sarah's case even more notorious. Calhoun's widow, Margaret Calhoun, insisted that Sarah's punishment should be public and spectacular. Margaret wanted Sarah executed in a way that would serve as an example and a warning to all enslaved people in the region. More than that, she wanted the entire community to witness it. Margaret Calhoun's grief had apparently turned to rage and a desire for revenge, and she used her considerable social influence to ensure that Sarah's execution would be a public spectacle. The trial itself was brief, lasting only one day. Sarah was brought into the courthouse in chains, her towering height making her an intimidating presence even bound and guarded. The prosecution presented witnesses who testified to Sarah's killing of Calhoun, describing in graphic detail how she had crushed his skull with her bare hands. The defense, such as it was, attempted to argue that Sarah had been provoked, that years of abuse and the loss of her child had driven her to temporary insanity. But this defense had little chance of success in a courtroom filled with white men who owned enslaved people themselves, and who saw Sarah's act as a direct threat to their way of life. Sarah herself was asked if she had anything to say. Standing in the witness box, towering over everyone in the courtroom, Sarah spoke for the first time since the killing. Her voice was clear and firm as she said, "He took my baby. He sold my baby away from me. I asked him not to. I begged him not to." But he took her anyway because he could, because she was his property, because I had no rights to my own child. So I took from him what he took from me. I took his life because he took everything that made my life worth living. I know you're going to kill me for what I did. That's fine. I'm not afraid to die. But before you kill me, you should know that I'm not sorry for what I did. If I could go back, I would do it again. He deserved what I gave him. This testimony shocked everyone in the courtroom. Enslaved people were not supposed to speak so boldly. Were not supposed to express no remorse. Were not supposed to suggest that their actions were justified. Sarah's words were defiant and unapologetic, and they made her even more terrifying to white observers, while making her even more heroic to enslaved people. The jury deliberated for less than 30 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty. The judge sentenced Sarah to death by hanging, to be carried out in 2 weeks' time in a public execution. But Margaret Calhoun was not satisfied with a simple hanging. She petitioned the court and the local authorities to allow her to stage a more elaborate punishment, one that would, in her words, strike terror into the hearts of all slaves who might contemplate violence against their masters. With the cooperation of local officials who shared her belief that Sarah's execution should serve as a powerful deterrent, Margaret arranged for Sarah's execution to be conducted in the center of town, in front of an assembled crowd that would include not just white residents, but also enslaved people from all the plantations in the region, who would be forced to attend to witness what happened to those who killed their masters. In the 2 weeks between Sarah's sentencing and her execution, she became famous throughout the South and even in the North. Newspaper accounts of her trial and the upcoming execution were published widely. Abolitionists seized on Sarah's case as evidence of slavery's brutality, pointing out that she had been driven to kill by the inhuman treatment she had endured and particularly by the theft of her child. They argued that Sarah was not a criminal but a victim who had been pushed past endurance. Southern newspapers countered that Sarah was a murderer who deserved the harshest punishment, that her defiance and lack of remorse proved the dangerous nature of enslaved people if they were not kept under strict control. The day of Sarah's execution, August 26, 1856, was clear and hot. By mid-morning, thousands of people had gathered in the town square where the gallows had been erected. White residents came from miles around, bringing picnics and making a festival of the execution. More horrifyingly, enslaved people were marched into town in groups from surrounding plantations, forced to watch as a warning of what would happen to them if they ever considered violence against their masters. The crowd was estimated at over 3,000 people, one of the largest gatherings in the region's history. Sarah was brought from the jail in chains, surrounded by armed guards as if she might somehow break free despite her bonds. When the crowd saw her, this giant of a woman, nearly 7 feet tall, walking with her head held high despite the chains, there was a collective gasp. She was both terrible and magnificent, a figure that inspired fear and awe in equal measure. Sarah was led up onto the gallows platform, and the charges against her and her sentence were read aloud to the crowd. Then Margaret Calhoun herself addressed the crowd. She spoke about her husband, about how he had been brutally murdered by this monster, about how Sarah represented the danger that all slaveholders faced from the people they held in bondage. She called for Sarah's execution to serve as a lesson that would never be forgotten, that would make clear the consequences of violence against masters. As Margaret spoke, Sarah stood silently on the platform, looking out over the assembled crowd, her expression unreadable. When it came time for Sarah to be asked if she had any final words, she was offered the opportunity to confess her sins and ask for God's forgiveness, which was customary in executions of that era. Sarah declined to make any such confession. Instead, she spoke directly to the enslaved people who had been forced to attend her execution. In a voice that carried across the silent crowd, Sarah said, They want you to see me die and be afraid. They want you to think that if you fight back, this will happen to you. But I want you to know that I'm not afraid. I did what I did and I would do it again. They can kill my body, but they can't kill the spirit that made me fight back. Remember that. Remember that we have power they can't take away. Remember that we're human beings, not animals, not property. And remember that someday, somehow, all of us will be free. These words, spoken by a woman moments from death, had an electric effect on the enslaved people in the crowd. Guards had to restrain several people who tried to call out to Sarah or who became emotional at her words. The white observers were outraged that Sarah was being allowed to speak in this way, but by the time anyone could stop her, she had said what she wanted to say. The executioner placed the noose around Sarah's neck, and at precisely noon, the trap door was opened. Sarah fell, and the noose tightened around her neck. But Sarah's great height and weight meant that her neck did not break cleanly, as would have been ideal for a relatively quick death. Instead, she slowly strangled, her body convulsing for several terrible minutes before she finally died. The crowd watched in a mixture of horror and satisfaction, depending on their perspective. For the white observers, Sarah's death represented justice and the restoration of proper order. For the enslaved people forced to witness it, Sarah's execution was both traumatic and inspiring. They had seen one of their own die terribly, but they had also seen her refuse to be broken, refuse to apologize, and call for resistance even in her final moments. The image of Sarah standing on the gallows, defiant and unafraid, would be remembered and passed down through generations of enslaved people as an example of courage and resistance. Sarah's body was left hanging for hours after her death, another element of the spectacle that Margaret Calhoun had arranged. She wanted Sarah's corpse to remain visible as a warning for as long as possible. Eventually, Sarah's body was taken down and buried in an unmarked grave in a corner of the local cemetery reserved for executed criminals. There was no marker, no memorial, nothing to indicate where the woman who had killed William Calhoun was laid to rest. But Sarah was not forgotten. In the days, weeks, and months following her execution, her story spread throughout the enslaved population of the South. It was told and retold, often embellished, sometimes mythologized. Sarah grew larger than life in the telling, her height increasing, her strength becoming superhuman, her words from the gallows becoming more poetic and inspiring. She became a legend, a symbol of resistance and defiance, a reminder that even enslaved people had power and could fight back against their oppressors. The reaction among slaveholders to Sarah's case was complex. Some saw it as confirmation that enslaved people needed to be controlled even more strictly, that any leniency or mercy would lead to violence and rebellion. Others, particularly those who had some capacity for self-reflection, began to question whether a system that created such rage and desperation might be unsustainable in the long term. If enslaved people were human beings rather than property, if they felt the loss of their children and the brutality of their treatment as deeply as white people would, then perhaps they could not be enslaved indefinitely without consequences. These questions became part of the broader debate over slavery that was intensifying in the 1850s and would eventually lead to the Civil War. Abolitionists pointed to cases like Sarah's as evidence that slavery was inherently violent and evil, that it destroyed families and drove people to desperate acts. Pro-slavery advocates argued that cases like Sarah's proved that enslaved people were dangerous and needed to be controlled, that emancipation would lead to widespread violence against white people. Both sides used Sarah's story to advance their arguments, though neither side engaged fully with Sarah as a person rather than as a symbol. The town where Sarah had been executed tried to move on from the spectacle, but found it impossible to forget. The gallows remained standing for years, becoming a grim landmark. Children would dare each other to approach it at night. Some people reported seeing Sarah's ghost standing where she had died, still defiant, still unbroken. Whether these ghost stories were genuine experiences or simply the community's collective guilt and fear manifesting as supernatural tales is impossible to determine, but the stories persisted for generations. Margaret Calhoun lived for another 20 years after Sarah's execution and her husband's death, eventually remarrying and leaving the Riverside plantation. The plantation itself was sold and changed hands several times, with various owners struggling to make it profitable. Some attributed this difficulty to economic factors, but local enslaved people believed that the plantation was cursed by what had happened there, that Sarah's blood and Calhoun's blood had soaked into the ground and poisoned it. The Civil War came 5 years after Sarah's execution, and with it came the end of slavery that Sarah had called for from the gallows. When enslaved people in Georgia were finally freed, many of them remembered Sarah and the example she had set. Some formerly enslaved people made pilgrimages to the town where she had been executed, trying to find where she had been buried, wanting to pay respects to a woman who had become a symbol of resistance and courage. In the decades following the Civil War, Sarah's story continued to be told in African American communities, passed down through oral tradition. Different versions of the story emphasized different elements. Some focused on her extraordinary size and strength, portraying her as almost superhuman. Others focused on her loss of her child and her grief-driven rage. Still others emphasized her defiant words from the gallows and her refusal to apologize or show remorse. In the 20th century, as scholars began to document and preserve African American history more systematically, Sarah's story was researched and verified. Court records confirmed that there had indeed been an enslaved woman named Sarah who had killed her master William Calhoun in August 1856 and who had been publicly executed later that month. Newspaper accounts from the era provided additional details about the trial and execution. While some elements of the story as it had been passed down through oral tradition were exaggerated or embellished, the core facts were accurate. Sarah had killed her master after he sold her child. She had done so with extraordinary violence, and she had been defiant and unrepentant in the face of death. Modern scholars studying Sarah's case have examined it from various perspectives. Historians of slavery have used it as an example of the violence inherent in the slave system and the ways that enslaved people resisted despite terrible odds. Scholars of gender have analyzed Sarah's case in terms of how her unusual size challenged gender norms and expectations, how her physical power was both an asset and a burden, and how her execution was staged in ways that tried to diminish and punish that power. Psychologists have examined Sarah's case in terms of trauma, grief, and the breaking points of human endurance under extreme oppression. The question of whether Sarah's killing of William Calhoun was justified remains complex and contested. By any legal standard of her time or ours, murder is wrong, and killing someone even in rage and grief does not change that. But the context of Sarah's actions, the theft of her child, the years of brutal treatment, the complete lack of any legal recourse or protection, the systematic dehumanization of the slavery system, creates moral complexity that cannot be easily resolved. Was Sarah a murderer who deserved punishment, or was she a victim who finally struck back against her oppressor? Different people examining her case will reach different conclusions based on their moral frameworks and their perspectives on resistance to oppression. What can be said is that Sarah's story is a powerful reminder of slavery's violence and its consequences. The system that allowed William Calhoun to own Sarah as property, to work her brutally, to sell her child away from her without regard for her feelings or her rights as a mother, created the conditions for the violence that followed. Sarah's rage did not come from nowhere. It was built through years of abuse and deprivation, focused through the unbearable loss of her child, and finally expressed through the only means of resistance available to her, her physical strength. Sarah's public execution, particularly the way it was staged as a spectacle to terrorize enslaved people, also reveals something important about the slave system. Slaveholders lived in constant fear of the people they held in bondage, understanding at some level that their power rested on violence and terror rather than on any legitimate authority or consent. The need to make Sarah's execution so public, so elaborate, so specifically designed to strike fear into enslaved people reveals the fragility of the slaveholders' power. If they were truly secure in their authority, such extreme measures would not have been necessary. The impact of Sarah's story on the enslaved people who witnessed her execution or who heard about it cannot be overstated. For people living under constant oppression, with no hope of justice or relief, Sarah's act of resistance and her defiant words from the gallows provided a different narrative. She showed that enslaved people could fight back, that they had power even if using that power came at the ultimate cost, and that they could face death without being broken in spirit. This was a powerful message that helped sustain resistance and hope even in the darkest circumstances. In recent decades, there have been efforts to more formally memorialize Sarah and to ensure that her story is not forgotten. In 2015, a historical marker was placed near the site where Sarah was executed, acknowledging what had happened there and honoring Sarah's memory. The marker's text was carefully crafted to present Sarah not as a simple victim or a simple hero, but as a complex human being who made a desperate choice in impossible circumstances. The marker has become a site of pilgrimage for people interested in this history, and for descendants of enslaved people who see Sarah as part of their heritage. There have also been proposals for other forms of memorialization, including a statue of Sarah in the town where she was executed. This proposal has been controversial, with some people arguing that Sarah should be honored as a symbol of resistance to oppression, while others argue that creating a statue of someone who killed another person sends the wrong message regardless of the circumstances. These debates reflect ongoing tensions about how to memorialize difficult and violent history, how to honor victims of oppression without seeming to celebrate violence, and how to tell complex stories that don't fit neatly into categories of hero or villain. In 2019, a novelist published a fictionalized account of Sarah's life, imagining her childhood, her relationships, her inner thoughts, and the events leading up to her killing of Calhoun. While this novel was clearly labeled as fiction and took creative liberties with the historical record, it was based on extensive research and attempted to give Sarah a fuller, more human portrayal than was possible in the bare facts of the historical record. The novel sparked renewed interest in Sarah's story and introduced it to a new generation of readers. The question of what happened to Sarah's daughter Ruth, who was sold away at age 3 and whom Sarah never saw again, has intrigued researchers. Several attempts have been made to trace Ruth's fate through slave sale records and other documents, but no conclusive evidence has been found. Ruth would have been about 6 years old when her mother was executed, old enough to have some memories of Sarah, but young enough that those memories might have been hazy or uncertain. Whether Ruth ever learned what had happened to her mother, whether she knew that Sarah had killed her master in rage over Ruth's sale, whether she ever tried to find information about her mother after emancipation, none of these questions can be answered with certainty based on surviving records. It is possible that Ruth survived slavery, lived to see emancipation, perhaps had children and grandchildren of her own. If so, there may be descendants of Sarah alive today who are unaware of their connection to this remarkable woman. Some genealogists and family historians have worked to try to trace Sarah's lineage, But the incomplete and often unreliable records of enslaved people make this work extremely difficult. Nevertheless, the possibility exists that Sarah's bloodline continues, that her descendants are living their lives unaware that they are related to a woman who became legendary for her resistance to oppression. Sarah's story also raises important questions about physical difference and how society responds to people who don't fit expected norms. Sarah's extraordinary height made her valuable as enslaved labor precisely because she could do work that others could not. But that same physical difference made her threatening, marked her as abnormal, and contributed to how she was treated both during her life and after her death. When she killed William Calhoun, her size became part of the horror of the story for white observers. She was described as a giantess and a monster, language that dehumanized her and made her seem less like a person and more like a force of nature or a creature from nightmares. But for enslaved people, Sarah's size was part of what made her inspiring. She was powerful in ways that most enslaved people could never be, and she used that power to strike back against an oppressor. Her physical difference became a source of pride and possibility rather than shame. The nickname Goliath's daughter that enslaved people gave her was not meant as an insult, but as an acknowledgement of her strength and stature. In the biblical story, Goliath was a giant who was defeated by the young David. But in renaming Sarah as Goliath's daughter, enslaved people were reclaiming the giant as a figure of power, rather than as a symbol of something to be defeated. Modern scholars studying disability history and the history of physical difference have used Sarah's case as an example of how bodies that don't conform to expected norms have been understood and treated throughout history. Sarah's height was not a disability in the technical sense. It did not prevent her from functioning or cause her health problems as far as we know. But it marked her as different and affected how she was treated by both enslavers and fellow enslaved people. Her story illustrates how physical difference intersects with race, gender, and power in complex ways. The legal aftermath of Sarah's case is also worth examining. After her execution, there was some discussion in legal circles about whether the trial had been conducted fairly, whether Sarah had been given adequate defense, and whether the sentence had been appropriate. A few voices argued that Sarah should have been allowed to present evidence about the abuse she had suffered and the loss of her child as mitigating factors, that she had been denied due process, and that her execution had been more about terror and example-making than about justice. But these voices were very much in the minority. The dominant legal view was that Sarah had received all the process she was entitled to under the law, that the verdict and sentence were appropriate, and that her execution had been justified and necessary. The fact that Sarah was enslaved meant that she had limited legal rights, and the fact that she had killed her master meant that the punishment had to be severe to maintain the social order that slavery depended upon. This legal discussion, limited though it was, represented early cracks in the legal justifications for slavery. If enslaved people were property without rights, then how could they be held criminally responsible for their actions? If they were human beings capable of moral choice and criminal responsibility, then how could they simultaneously be property? These contradictions were not new. They had been inherent in slavery since its beginning, but cases like Sarah's made them harder to ignore. The Civil War would ultimately render these legal questions moot by ending slavery altogether. But the debates around Sarah's case were part of the broader discourse that contributed to the growing recognition that slavery was morally and legally indefensible. Abolitionists pointed to Sarah's case in their arguments, asking how a just society could enslave a mother, sell away her child, and then execute her for responding to this cruelty with violence. In the post-Civil War period, during Reconstruction and beyond, Sarah's story took on new meanings. For newly freed Black people building new lives in freedom, Sarah represented both the horrors of the past and the strength that had allowed them to survive and resist. Her story was told to children and grandchildren as a reminder of what their ancestors had endured and how they had fought back even at terrible cost. Sarah became part of a tradition of resistance that included both those who had fought for freedom and those who had simply survived and maintained their humanity in the face of dehumanization. For white Southerners in the post-war period, Sarah's story was more complicated and uncomfortable. Some continued to see her as a murderer who had been justly punished. Others began to recognize that slavery had created the conditions for violence like Sarah's, and that perhaps the system itself had been unjust. Still others simply wanted to forget, to move past the difficult history of slavery and focus on rebuilding. But Sarah's story refused to be forgotten, kept alive by Black communities who saw her as an important part of their history. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Jim Crow laws reimposed many of the restrictions and oppressions of slavery in new forms, Sarah's story took on renewed relevance. Black people living under segregation and facing violence and discrimination looked back to figures like Sarah, who had resisted oppression even at ultimate cost. Her story became part of the cultural memory that sustained resistance movements and that ultimately contributed to the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. The question of whether Sarah's height was the result of a medical condition has been raised by some modern researchers. Extreme height can result from various conditions including gigantism caused by excess growth hormone. If Sarah did have such a condition, it would likely have caused health problems eventually, though she died young enough that these problems might not have manifested yet. However, there is no way to know for certain whether Sarah's height was the result of a medical condition or simply represented the extreme end of normal human variation. What is clear is that Sarah's height was extraordinary for her time and place. The average height for women in the 1850s was around 52 to 54, making Sarah literally towering over most people. Her height would have been remarkable even today when better nutrition has led to increased average heights. At 68, Sarah would still be considered exceptionally tall, particularly for a woman. In her own time, she must have seemed almost superhuman to many people who encountered her. This extraordinary physical presence undoubtedly affected every aspect of Sarah's life. As a child, she would have been marked as different from the beginning. As a teenager and young adult, her height would have affected how people perceived and treated her. Her size made her valuable as enslaved labor, but also made her more visible and perhaps more vulnerable to certain types of abuse. When she finally struck back at her oppressor, her size gave her the physical capability to kill a man with her bare hands, but it also made her more terrifying to those who witnessed or heard about the killing. The image of Sarah standing on the gallows, towering over everyone around her, defiant in the face of death, has become iconic in retellings of her story. She refused to be diminished even at the moment of her execution, refused to bow or apologize, insisted on being seen as she was, powerful, angry, and unrepentant. This image has resonated across generations as a symbol of resistance to oppression and of the human capacity to maintain dignity and defiance even in the face of death. As we reflect on Sarah's story more than 160 years after her death, we are confronted with difficult questions that remain relevant today. How do we judge acts of violence committed by people who have been subjected to extreme oppression and have no other recourse? How do we balance our condemnation of violence with our understanding of the circumstances that drove people to desperate acts? How do we honor the memory of people who resisted oppression, even when that resistance took violent forms? These questions have no easy answers, but Sarah's story demands that we grapple with them honestly. She was not a saint or a simple victim. She was a woman who killed a man in rage and grief. But she was also a woman who had been enslaved, brutalized, and robbed of everything she loved by a system of oppression that denied her humanity and gave her no legitimate means of seeking justice. Her violence grew out of the violence that had been done to her, and her refusal to show remorse reflected her understanding that the true injustice was not her killing of William Calhoun, but the system that had created the conditions for that killing. Sarah's daughter Ruth, sold away at 3 years old, represents all the children who were torn from their parents by slavery, all the families that were destroyed by a system that treated human beings as property to be bought and sold at will. The fact that we do not know what happened to Ruth, that she disappears from the historical record after her sale, reflects how slavery erased the stories and lives of millions of people. Ruth was somewhere, living her life, growing up, perhaps eventually having her own children, but we cannot trace her path because the records of enslaved people's lives are so incomplete. The gap where Ruth's story should be is as much a part of slavery's legacy as the violence that Sarah committed. Slavery destroyed families, erased histories, and left enormous holes in the historical record where millions of individual stories should be. When we tell Sarah's story, we must also acknowledge all the untold stories, all the people whose experiences and resistance and suffering were never recorded, never preserved, never passed down. Sarah's legacy lives on in multiple forms. Her story is part of the historical record, documented in court records and newspaper accounts. It is part of oral tradition, passed down through generations of African Americans who kept her memory alive. It is part of scholarly discourse, analyzed and examined by historians and other researchers trying to understand slavery and resistance. And it is part of popular culture, retold in various forms including novels, documentaries, and now this account. But perhaps Sarah's most important legacy is simply the example she set of resistance and defiance in the face of overwhelming oppression. She refused to accept her dehumanization, refused to submit quietly to the theft of her child, refused to apologize for striking back at her oppressor, and refused to be broken even in the face of death. These refusals, this insistence on being seen and heard as a human being with agency and dignity, represent a form of victory even in defeat. When Sarah stood on the gallows and spoke to the enslaved people who had been forced to witness her execution, when she told them to remember their humanity and their power, when she predicted that someday they would all be free, she was asserting something that the slavery system tried desperately to deny: that enslaved people were human beings with the capacity for resistance, with the right to freedom, and with the power to ultimately overcome their oppression. That freedom came, though not in Sarah's lifetime. The Civil War ended slavery, and the enslaved people Sarah had addressed from the gallows did become free. Whether any of them were present at that execution and lived to see emancipation, whether they remembered Sarah's words when freedom finally came, we cannot know. But we can honor Sarah's memory by remembering her story, by acknowledging both the violence of what she did and the violence that was done to her, by recognizing her humanity and her agency, and by continuing the work of creating a society where no one is subjected to the kind of oppression that drove Sarah to her desperate act. The physical site where Sarah was executed has changed over the years. The gallows are long gone, the town has grown and evolved, and the location where she died is now marked only by the historical marker placed in 2015. But the memory of what happened there persists, carried forward by each generation that learns Sarah's story and recognizes in it something important about human nature, about oppression and resistance, about violence and justice, and about the long shadow that slavery continues to cast over American society. Sarah died in 1856, her body buried in an unmarked grave, her life cut short at 28 years old. She lived less than 3 decades, and most of those years were spent in bondage, suffering and laboring for the profit of people who saw her as property rather than as a person. But in her final act of resistance, and in her defiant words from the gallows, Sarah claimed her humanity and her power in ways that have echoed across the generations. She became Goliath's daughter indeed, not a giant to be defeated, but a giant who stood up against her oppressor and refused to be conquered in spirit even when her body was bound and executed. This is Sarah's story, the macabre history of a woman whose extraordinary size gave her extraordinary strength, whose terrible losses gave her terrible rage, and whose final act of violence shocked the South and challenged the very foundations of the slave system. May her memory be preserved, may her story be told, and may we learn from both her suffering and her resistance as we continue the ongoing work of creating a more just and humane society.